When Amara, a black artist with a unique and powerful voice, faces relentless rejection from the art world, she's forced to question whether her work will ever be appreciated. But when a progressive gallery takes a chance on her, her art becomes an international sensation. Now, as the same people who once dismissed her scramble to ride her success, Amara must confront a dangerous choice. Will she let the fame consume her, or will she finally have the last word in the art world's twisted game? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's dive in. The soft, rhythmic sound of bristles brushing against canvas filled the dimly lit room. As Amara worked, her focus entirely absorbed in the strokes of her brush. The paint's colors blended into one another, merging warm hues with deep, somber tones, an outward expression of the storm of emotions that swirled within her. Each line she painted was precise, yet bursting with raw energy, carrying the weight of thoughts she found difficult to express with words. The light from the large windows behind her bathed the studio in a golden hue, reflecting the late afternoon sun, but Amara didn't notice. She had been working for hours, moving between the easel and the floor where she mixed her paints, a familiar routine that brought her solace in its repetition. This painting, this piece, was different. It was more than just an art project. It carried the full weight of her experiences, her frustrations, and her hopes. And yet, as she stepped back to observe her nearly completed work, a heavy feeling of doubt crept in, uninvited. She had been here before. The overwhelming sensation of disappointment, lingering just on the edge of hope, had become all too familiar over the years. Her gaze lingered on the vibrant, textured layers of the canvas, a reflection of everything she had poured into it, her heart and soul. And yet, in the back of her mind, she already feared the inevitable rejection. Amara took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the edges of her canvas as if to draw strength from it. How many times had she stood in this exact spot, feeling the quiet pulse of anticipation, only to face another indifferent shrug or polite dismissal from a gallery owner? Too many to count. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the heavy silence of the room. Amara blinked, realizing just how late it had gotten. She glanced at the screen and saw Sarah's name. Without hesitation, she answered, welcoming the familiar voice of her best friend, who had been her constant support in this seemingly endless uphill battle. "Amara, please tell me you finished it." Sarah's voice bubbled with excitement, a sharp contrast to the weight of Amara's mood. Amara smiled despite herself. "Yeah, it's finished." "Well?" Sarah's voice buzzed in anticipation. "What do you think?" Amara hesitated, casting another glance at the painting. "I think it's good, but you know how this goes, Sarah. She paused, swallowing the knot in her throat. "I don't know if it'll be enough." Sarah let out a small sigh on the other end. "Amara, don't do that to yourself. You're amazing, and your work is brilliant. It's just a matter of the right person seeing it." "The right person hasn't come along yet," Amara muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's voice softened. "I know it's tough, but you can't give up. This piece could be the one. You never know." Amara didn't respond right away. The sting of past rejections still clung to her, each one a fresh wound that never seemed to fully heal. She had submitted her art to nearly every gallery in the area, only to be met with disinterest, veiled criticisms, or, worst of all, those thinly disguised words that seemed to drip with condescension. She still remembered the first time she had tried to get her art into a well-known gallery. Thomas, the gallery owner, had stood before her piece, a powerful mural depicting the struggle for unity in a fragmented world, and after a long, thoughtful pause, simply said, "It's not quite what our audience is looking for." He hadn't even asked about her inspiration or what the painting represented. Amara had quickly realized that it wasn't her art he was rejecting. It was her. Or rather, what she represented in a world that wasn't ready to embrace artists like her, an up-and-coming black woman whose work defied conventional narratives. The art world, like much of society, wasn't designed to include people like her. The doors she knocked on always seemed to remain firmly closed, no matter how loudly she knocked. Sarah's voice pulled her back to the present. "Are you taking it to Thomas's gallery again?" Amara sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "I made an appointment for tomorrow." Amara. Sarah's tone was hesitant, filled with concern. I know how much his opinion weighs on you, but maybe this time, I have to try. Amara interrupted, her voice firm, though exhaustion lingered beneath her words. I don't have any other options right now. I need to do this. Sarah didn't press further. She knew better than anyone how hard Amara had fought to get to this point, and how many times she had faced rejection after rejection. Okay, but remember, no matter what happens, you're incredible. Your art is incredible. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. Amara smiled faintly, her heart warming at her friend's unwavering support. Thanks, Sarah. I'll let you know how it goes. The next morning, Amara found herself standing outside Thomas's gallery, her canvas carefully wrapped in protective cloth. The building loomed over her. An imposing structure of glass and metal, stark and modern, much like the art displayed within. A nervous energy churned in her stomach as she walked through the heavy glass doors and into the quiet, pristine space. Thomas greeted her with a curt nod, barely looking up from his clipboard as she entered. Amara's palms grew clammy as she approached him, her fingers tightening around the edges of her canvas. Let's see what you've brought this time, Thomas said, his tone flat and professional, offering none of the warmth or enthusiasm that could ease her nerves. Amara carefully unwrapped the canvas, her hands trembling slightly. She placed it on the easel before him, stepping back to let him examine it. Thomas stared at the painting for a few seconds, his face unreadable. Then, with a nonchalant shrug, he turned back to his clipboard. It's not quite what we're looking for, he said, almost mechanically. The words felt like a punch to the gut, even though she had expected them. She had heard them too many times before. I see, Amara said, her voice barely steady as she wrapped the canvas back up, her heart sinking deeper with each passing second. As she turned to leave, Thomas added, maybe next time. But Amara knew better. His words, polite as they were, carried no promise. There wouldn't be a next time. Not here. Not with him. Stepping out into the fresh air, the sun shining brightly overhead, Amara clutched the canvas to her chest. Her mind was racing, but all she could feel was the heavy weight of defeat pressing down on her. Another door had closed, another rejection. But as she walked away from the gallery, the familiar sting in her chest, Amara couldn't shake the small flicker of hope that still somehow burned within her. She had been through this before, and though it hurt, though it felt like the world was constantly against her, she knew she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Because somewhere out there, someone would see her art for what it truly was. And that day, her work would finally have a home. Amara's footsteps echoed down the quiet street as she walked home, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the sidewalk. She carried her wrapped canvas under one arm, the weight of it pulling at her shoulder. But it wasn't just the canvas that felt heavy. It was everything. The rejection from Thomas's gallery sat like a stone in her chest, a familiar ache that never seemed to dull with time. As she approached her apartment, the neighborhood's familiar sounds filled the air. Children playing, distant music, the faint hum of traffic. This place had been her home for as long as she could remember, and while it offered some comfort, it was also a reminder of everything she was still fighting to overcome. Inside, she leaned the canvas against the wall and sat down on the worn couch, staring blankly at the space in front of her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Sarah, checking in on how things had gone. Amara sighed and ignored the call. She wasn't ready to talk about it yet. Instead, her mind drifted, pulling her back into memories she had tried to forget but never could. Flashes of moments from her childhood, when she first started to realize that the world wasn't as welcoming as she had once believed. As a child, art had been her escape, an innocent, untainted passion. She would draw for hours, filling up notebooks with sketches, her mind alive with creativity. Back then, it didn't matter who saw her work or what they thought of it. All that mattered was the joy she felt when she created something new. But as she got older, things changed. She remembered a day from her early teens when she was 13 and full of hope. Her school had held an art competition, and she had poured her heart into her submission, a vibrant painting of a community garden with people of all different backgrounds working together. She had been so proud of it, convinced that her message of unity would resonate with the judges. But when the winners were announced, Amara's name wasn't called. Instead, the prize went to a classmate whose painting, while technically well done, lacked any of the emotional depth or message that Amara had worked so hard to convey. The judges, all older white men, had praised the winner's refined technique and classical composition. It had been the first time Amara truly felt the sting of injustice. Her teacher had patted her on the back afterward and said, "Your painting was great, Amara, but maybe next time try something a little more traditional. Something that fits what the judges are looking for." The memory still made her chest tighten. Even at 13, she had understood what that meant. Her art, her voice, wasn't valued. Not because it wasn't good, but because it didn't fit into the mold of what people in power wanted to see. From that moment on, she became aware of the subtle but ever-present barriers she would face as a black artist. People didn't say it outright, but it was there in the way they looked at her work, in the questions they asked or didn't ask. The art world was filled with gatekeepers, and for someone like her, those gates were almost always closed. Her parents had always been supportive, though. They had encouraged her passion from the beginning, never letting her forget how talented she was, no matter how many times she faced rejection. Her father, in particular, had a way of reminding her that her art was important, even if the world wasn't ready for it yet. She picked up her phone and called him now, needing to hear his steady voice. It rang twice before he answered. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "How'd it go today?" Amara hesitated. "It was pretty much what I expected." There was a pause on the other end. Her father knew exactly what that meant. "I'm sorry to hear that, Amara, but you know what I'm going to say." "I know, Dad. Keep going. Don't let them stop me." "Exactly." His voice was firm but gentle. "You've got something special, Amara. Don't let anyone make you feel like it's not enough. Their vision is limited. Yours isn't." She closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. Her father had always had a way of seeing the bigger picture, even when everything felt impossible. He had grown up in a time when opportunities were even more scarce, yet he had always pushed forward, always believed in a better future. "Thanks, Dad," she said quietly. I don't know how much more of this I can take. It feels like every door is closed before I even get the chance to knock." "I know it feels that way," her father replied. "But sometimes the right door takes a little longer to find. And when you find it, you'll realize that all the rejections led you there for a reason." They talked for a little while longer, about nothing in particular, but it helped. By the time Amara hung up, she felt a little lighter, though the weight of rejection still pressed on her shoulders. As the days passed, Amara tried to keep herself busy, throwing herself into her work. She spent hours in her studio, sketching and painting, using her frustration as fuel. But no matter how hard she tried, the sting of her most recent rejection clung to her like a shadow. It wasn't just the rejection itself. It was the reminder of all the times she had been overlooked, all the times her work had been dismissed, not for its quality, but for something she had no control over. Her mind flashed back to an art show she had attended a year ago, where her work had been featured alongside other up-and-coming artists. She had been so excited, hopeful that this would be the moment when things finally turned around. But as the night went on, it became clear that her work wasn't drawing the same attention as the others. She watched as patrons and gallery owners flocked to the pieces created by white artists, praising their innovative techniques and bold visions, while her work was barely glanced at. It wasn't until the end of the night, when an older white man had approached her, that she finally got some feedback. "Your work is interesting," he had said, his tone condescending. "But have you considered focusing on more traditional themes? People are looking for something they can relate to." Amara had smiled politely, though inside she had felt like screaming. More traditional themes. Something they could relate to. It was the same coded language she had heard over and over again. Art that reflected her experiences, her identity, wasn't considered universal. It wasn't something people could connect with, because the people he was talking about weren't people like her. Now, sitting in her studio, those words echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the barriers she faced. She knew that her work had power, that it spoke to something deep and important, but it seemed that the world wasn't ready to listen. A knock on her door pulled her out of her thoughts. She opened it to find Luca, a young art critic she had met at a small local gallery a few months ago. Luca had always been kind, always seemed genuinely interested in her work, which was rare in a world filled with superficial praise. "Hey," Luca said with a smile, holding a coffee in one hand and a sketchbook in the other. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. How's everything going?" Amara hesitated, not wanting to unload all her frustrations on him. "It's going." Luca raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound too convincing." Amara shrugged. "Just dealing with the usual, rejection, doubt, the overwhelming sense that the world isn't built for people like me." Luca sat down on the edge of the couch, setting the coffee on the table. "I hear you. But I've seen your work, Amara. I know how powerful it is, and I know I'm not the only one." She appreciated his words, but they didn't fully ease the weight on her chest. "Thanks, Luca. It feels like no matter how hard I try, it's never enough." Luca leaned forward, his expression serious. "I know it's tough, but I've been thinking, there's this new gallery opening downtown. It's small, but the owner is really progressive, and they're looking to showcase diverse artists. I think it could be a good fit for you." Amara's heart skipped a beat. "You think so?" "I do," Luca said with conviction. "They're interested in artists who push boundaries, who have something real to say, and that's you." For the first time in days, Amara felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the opportunity she had been waiting for. Maybe this time, things would be different. Amara sat quietly in her studio, staring at the canvas she had been working on for days. The colors on the canvas were rich and vibrant, but today they seemed muted to her, almost lifeless. She had poured her heart into it, just like every piece she created, but the lingering doubt from Thomas's rejection still gnawed at her confidence. No matter how much she tried to shake it, the feeling clung to her like a shadow. But Luca's words echoed in her mind. The idea of a new gallery, one that was open to showcasing artists who had been overlooked, was a glimmer of hope that she couldn't ignore. Could this really be the opportunity she had been waiting for? She wasn't sure. But she knew one thing: she had to try. Later that evening, Amara found herself sitting with Luca at a small cafe near the heart of the city. The place had an artsy, eclectic vibe: dim lighting, mismatched furniture, and walls covered in local artists' work. It was the kind of place that usually brought her comfort, a space where creativity was celebrated. But tonight, her mind was restless. Luca, always a step ahead, had already contacted the gallery owner on her behalf. Now, they were waiting for his response. "I know it's a lot to take in," Luca said, his voice gentle but full of energy. "But this gallery's different, Amara. I've talked to the owner. She's passionate about giving space to voices that have been silenced." Amara sipped her tea, the warmth soothing but not enough to calm her nerves. "I want to believe that," she said slowly. "But I've heard it all before, you know? People say they want to give opportunities to diverse artists, but when it comes down to it, they still choose the ones who fit their mold." Luca nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that, but I really believe this time could be different. You've got nothing to lose by trying." She considered his words. There was truth in them. She had already faced countless rejections. What was one more? But there was something about Luca's optimism that made her want to believe, even if just for a moment, that maybe this gallery could be the place where her art finally found a home. The following week, Amara walked through the doors of the gallery Luca had spoken so highly of. The space was intimate, far smaller than the prestigious galleries she had previously tried to get into, but there was something warm and welcoming about it. The walls were filled with pieces from artists she had never heard of, each one unique and deeply personal. It felt like a place where her work might actually belong. The gallery owner, a woman named Elise, greeted her with a genuine smile. She was middle-aged, with curly gray hair that framed her face and a pair of round glasses perched on her nose. Her eyes were bright with curiosity and kindness, and Amara instantly felt at ease. "I'm so glad you're here, Amara," Elise said, shaking her hand warmly. "Luca's told me so much about you. I've been looking forward to seeing your work." Amara smiled nervously, her heart racing as she handed over the portfolio she had brought with her. "Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity." Elise took the portfolio and led Amara to a small seating area near the back of the gallery. As Elise flipped through the pages, Amara held her breath, waiting for some sign of approval or worse, the familiar look of disinterest she had seen so many times before. But instead, Elise's expression softened, and her eyes lit up as she studied each piece. "This is extraordinary," Elise said quietly, her voice full of admiration. "Your work is powerful. There's a depth here, an emotional resonance that I don't see often." Amara blinked, not quite believing what she was hearing. "You think so?" "I know so," Elise replied, looking up from the portfolio to meet Amara's eyes. "You have something important to say with your art. It's raw, it's real, and it's exactly what I want to showcase here." Amara felt a surge of relief, followed quickly by disbelief. After years of hearing no, she wasn't sure how to react to someone finally saying yes. Her mind struggled to process it, the words hanging in the air like a distant dream. Elise smiled at her, sensing her hesitation. "I'm serious, Amara. I want to feature your work in our next exhibition. This gallery is about giving artists like you a voice, and I think your work will make a real impact." Amara's heart pounded in her chest, her emotions swirling in a mix of excitement and anxiety. I don't know what to say. I wasn't expecting this." "You don't have to say anything right now," Elise said gently. "Take some time to think it over, but I hope you'll say yes. Your art deserves to be seen." As Amara left the gallery that day, her mind was spinning. For the first time in a long time, she felt like the door was opening just a crack, like there was a sliver of hope that, maybe, just maybe, things could change. But with that hope came a new kind of fear. The fear of what might happen if it all went wrong. She had been burned before, and the idea of getting her hopes up only to be disappointed again was terrifying. When she called Sarah that evening to tell her the news, her friend's reaction was exactly what she expected. Pure excitement. "This is it, Amara," Sarah exclaimed, practically shouting into the phone. "I knew it. I knew something like this would come along for you." "I don't know," Amara said cautiously, pacing the floor of her apartment. "I want to believe it, but I'm scared, Sarah. What if it's just another false start?" "You can't think like that," Sarah said firmly. "You've worked so hard for this. You deserve it. Don't let fear hold you back." Amara sighed, sitting down on the edge of her bed. "I know. It's just, every time I've let myself get excited about something like this, it's fallen apart." "That doesn't mean it will this time," Sarah said, her tone softening. "You have to take the leap, Amara. I know it's scary, but if you don't try, you'll never know what could have been." Her words echoed in Amara's mind long after they hung up the phone. She knew Sarah was right. She couldn't let fear keep her from moving forward, from taking a chance on herself and her work. But the weight of her past failures clung to her, a constant reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. Still, something about Elise's sincerity had struck a chord with Amara. The way she had looked at her art, really looked at it, had been different from any gallery owner she had met before. There was no condescension, no dismissal, only genuine appreciation. Amara spent the next few days in a state of anxious excitement, going back and forth in her mind about whether or not to accept Elise's offer. Every time she thought about saying yes, a voice in the back of her head whispered doubts, reminding her of all the times she had been let down before. But finally, after days of agonizing indecision, Amara made her choice. She stood outside the gallery once again, this time with a sense of determination she hadn't felt in a long time. As she walked through the doors, Elise greeted her with a warm smile, as if she already knew what Amara had come to say. "I've thought about it," Amara said, her voice steady, "and I'd love to be part of your exhibition." Elise's smile widened. "I'm so glad to hear that, Amara. We're going to do something incredible with your work. I can feel it." For the first time in what felt like forever, Amara allowed herself to believe in the possibility of success. Maybe this was the start of something new, something bigger than she had dared to imagine. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for now, she had a sense of hope that had been missing for far too long. The day of the exhibition came faster than Amara expected. She stood in the center of the gallery, surrounded by her pieces, each one hanging on the pristine white walls, illuminated by carefully positioned lights. The small gallery buzzed with excitement as the evening approached, and soon the space would be filled with art lovers, critics, and patrons. Amara tried to steady her breathing, her heart racing with a mixture of nerves and excitement. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, pouring herself into every piece, making sure each brushstroke spoke to the depth of emotion she wanted to convey. And now it was here, the first real opportunity for her work to be seen, truly seen, by an audience that might appreciate it for what it was. Elise had been a constant source of reassurance throughout the process. She had overseen every detail of the exhibition with a calm, confident demeanor, always reminding Amara that her art was powerful, that it deserved this space. Even now, as Elise walked through the gallery, checking last-minute details, she caught Amara's eye and gave her an encouraging smile. "You ready for this?" Elise asked, her voice light but full of meaning. Amara took a deep breath and nodded. "I think so. I don't want to get my hopes up too high, you know?" Elise placed a hand on her shoulder, her touch reassuring. "It's natural to feel that way, but trust me, Amara, tonight is going to be special. Your work is going to speak for itself." Amara wanted to believe that, but the doubt still lingered at the back of her mind. She couldn't help but think of all the times she had put her heart on display, only to be met with indifference or rejection. What if this was just another false start? What if no one cared? As the doors to the gallery opened, a slow trickle of people began to fill the space. At first, it was a few familiar faces: Luca, Sarah, and a handful of other local artists who had always supported her work. They greeted her warmly, offering words of encouragement and admiration for the pieces on display. It was comforting. But Amara's eyes kept drifting to the door, waiting for the strangers, the critics, the people who could make or break her career. Soon, more people began to arrive, and the gallery started to hum with the sounds of conversation and footsteps. Amara's heart raced as she watched groups of patrons move from piece to piece, their faces thoughtful, their voices hushed. She couldn't hear everything they were saying, but she saw their reactions, some nodding in appreciation, others tilting their heads in deep contemplation. And then something unexpected happened. A woman standing near one of her most personal pieces, a large canvas filled with bold colors and abstract forms, representing the complex emotions of her identity as a black woman in a world that often marginalized her, began to cry. Not a quiet, subtle tear, but deep, emotional sobs that she tried to stifle with her hand. Amara froze, watching from a distance as Elise moved toward the woman, offering her a gentle touch on the arm. The woman spoke quietly, her voice thick with emotion, and though Amara couldn't hear what she was saying, she knew in that moment that her art had reached someone on a profound level. That was the moment everything shifted. Word began to spread quickly through the room. More and more people were drawn to that particular piece, and soon, the gallery was buzzing with conversation about the raw power and emotional depth of Amara's work. Patrons were asking Elise questions, critics were taking notes, and one or two people even began snapping pictures of the painting. With permission, of course. Amara stood there, watching it all unfold, feeling as though she were outside of herself, observing the surreal scene from a distance. Luca appeared beside her, a wide grin on his face. "I told you this would happen." Amara laughed, the sound shaky but full of disbelief. I can't believe it." "You better believe it," Luca said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "People are talking about you, really talking." Amara's chest swelled with a mix of pride and disbelief. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, but now that it was here, it felt almost too good to be true. She had prepared herself for the worst, for the possibility that no one would care, that her work would once again be dismissed as too different, too personal, too other. But instead, people were connecting with it, in ways she never could have predicted. As the night wore on, more and more people approached her, asking questions about her process, about the meanings behind her pieces. A well-known art critic, someone whose reviews had the power to launch an artist's career, even pulled her aside to ask about her inspirations. "Your work is unlike anything I've seen in a long time," the critic said, his tone thoughtful. "It's bold, it's emotional, and it feels deeply personal. I'd love to do a feature on you for our upcoming issue." I think people need to hear your story." Amara could hardly believe her ears. "Thank you. That would be incredible." As the critic moved on, Amara turned to Sarah, who had been watching the interaction with wide eyes. "Did that just happen?" Amara whispered. Sarah grinned, pulling her into a tight hug. "It happened, girl. You're making waves." The rest of the night passed in a blur of conversation, congratulations, and overwhelming emotions. By the time the gallery emptied and the doors closed behind the last patron, Amara felt as though she were floating. Elise approached her, her eyes bright with pride. "You did it," Elise said softly. "Your work made an impact tonight. You should be proud of yourself." Amara smiled, though the reality of what had happened hadn't fully sunk in yet. I'm so grateful for this opportunity, Elise. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Elise said with a wave of her hand. "Your talent speaks for itself. I'm just glad I could help bring it to the world." As Amara left the gallery that night, she walked through the quiet streets with a sense of fulfillment she had never felt before. Her work had been seen, truly seen, and appreciated for what it was. But more than that, it had touched people in ways she hadn't expected. The woman who cried, the critic who wanted to share her story, the patrons who had taken the time to connect with her art, they had all reminded her why she had started this journey in the first place. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about creating something that mattered, something that spoke to the human experience in all its complexity and pain and beauty. And tonight, for the first time, Amara felt like she had done that. But even as the excitement of the evening lingered in her chest, she couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt. What if this was just a fleeting moment of success? What if, after all of this, the world still wasn't ready to fully embrace her work? She had been here before, on the cusp of something big, only to have it slip away. As she lay in bed that night, her mind racing with thoughts of the future, Amara knew that the breakthrough she had experienced tonight was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was ready to face them. Because now, she knew her art had the power to change things, to open doors that had long been closed. And she wasn't going to let fear hold her back anymore. In the weeks that followed the exhibition, Amara's life seemed to change almost overnight. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages from gallery owners, journalists, and potential buyers. The art critic who had approached her at the exhibition wrote a glowing review of her work in a prominent magazine, describing her pieces as deeply emotional, raw, and urgent, art that speaks to the core of the human experience. That review alone opened doors that had once seemed sealed shut forever. Suddenly, the same galleries that had turned her away in the past were clamoring to display her work. People who had never given her a second glance were now eager to meet with her, to feature her art, to be associated with the rising star she had become. It was surreal, this sudden shift from being overlooked and ignored to being at the center of attention. But along with the newfound success came a complex mix of emotions that Amara wasn't fully prepared for. Yes, it was everything she had worked toward for years, the recognition, the validation, the chance to finally have her voice heard. But there was a bitter edge to it, too. Some of the very people who had once dismissed her art, who had told her it wasn't right for their galleries or their audiences, were now acting as if they had always believed in her talent. Thomas, the gallery owner who had rejected her work more times than she could count, had reached out to her just days after the exhibition. His message had been cordial, full of congratulations and an invitation to meet. "I'd love to discuss the possibility of featuring your work in an upcoming show," he had written, as if their past interactions had never happened. Amara stared at the email for a long time before closing it without replying. The success was exhilarating, but it was also disorienting. The world that had once been so cold and unwelcoming now seemed eager to embrace her. But Amara couldn't forget how hard she had fought to get to this point. How many times she had been made to feel like her art, her voice, her perspective wasn't good enough. It was difficult to know who was genuine and who was just trying to ride the wave of her newfound popularity. One morning, about a month after the exhibition, Amara sat in her studio, her latest painting in front of her. The colors on the canvas were bold, almost defiant, a reflection of the swirl of emotions she had been feeling since her rise to prominence. She had been invited to showcase her work at an international art fair, a huge opportunity that could catapult her career even further. But as exciting as the offer was, it came from a prestigious gallery that had rejected her work only a year ago. She couldn't help but feel conflicted. As she worked on the canvas, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Elise, the gallery owner who had believed in her from the start. Amara smiled, grateful for the steady presence Elise had been in her life over the past few months. Elise had never been anything but supportive, even as Amara's fame began to eclipse the small gallery where her breakthrough had happened. The message was short. "Can we talk? I have something important I want to run by you." Curious, Amara quickly called her back. Elise answered after just a few rings, her voice warm and familiar. "Amara, thanks for calling," Elise said. "I've been thinking a lot about your career and where you're headed. There's an offer on the table that I think you should seriously consider." Amara's interest piqued. "What kind of offer?" "It's from a major gallery, one of the top in the country," Elise explained. "They want to host a solo exhibition of your work. It's a huge opportunity, Amara. But I want you to think about something before you say yes." Amara frowned slightly. "What's that?" "There's been a lot of attention around your work lately, and while that's incredible, I don't want you to lose sight of why you started creating in the first place. These big galleries, they're seeing dollar signs now. They want to capitalize on the success you've built, but they weren't there for you when you needed them most." Amara's chest tightened. She knew exactly what Elise was talking about. The galleries, the critics, the patrons who had ignored her for so long were now flocking to her, not because they had suddenly discovered the beauty in her work, but because they saw an opportunity for profit. Elise continued, her voice gentle but firm. "You have a unique voice, Amara. Don't let these people co-opt your success. You don't have to say yes to every offer. You get to choose who gets to represent your work, and it should be someone who truly believes in you." Amara was silent for a moment, letting Elise's words sink in. She had been so caught up in the whirlwind of attention that she hadn't stopped to think about the bigger picture, about the integrity of her work, about what it meant to stay true to herself in the face of all this newfound success. "Thank you, Elise," Amara said quietly. "I needed to hear that." "Of course," Elise replied. "This is your journey. You get to decide how it unfolds." After they hung up, Amara sat in her studio for a long time, staring at her painting. Elise was right. She had spent so many years fighting to be heard, to have her work recognized, and now that it was finally happening, she needed to make sure she didn't lose herself in the process. Later that day, Amara received another email from Thomas. This time, it was more direct, practically pleading for a meeting to discuss how they could collaborate moving forward. He had even attached an article from a prominent art magazine that had named her one of the most promising young artists of the year, as if that alone would convince her to accept his offer. Amara's lips pressed into a thin line as she read the email. The audacity of it was almost laughable. Thomas, who had never given her the time of day, who had dismissed her work without a second glance, now wanted to collaborate because she was successful. The irony was almost too much to bear. She drafted a reply, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. "Thank you for your interest. However, I will not be working with your gallery at this time." Simple, direct, and final. As she hit send, Amara felt a sense of closure. For the first time, she wasn't the one knocking on the door. She wasn't the one begging for recognition. She was the one with the power to say no. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Amara continued to create, pouring herself into her art with a renewed sense of purpose. She accepted some of the offers that felt right, those that came from galleries and curators who genuinely appreciated her work for what it was, not just for its commercial potential. She turned down others, staying true to the advice Elise had given her. One evening, as she prepared for her upcoming international exhibition, Amara received a message from the woman who had cried at her first gallery show. The woman thanked Amara again for her art, explaining how deeply it had touched her and how it had helped her process her own feelings about identity and belonging. The message brought tears to Amara's eyes. It reminded her of why she had started this journey in the first place: to create art that spoke to people, that resonated with their experiences, that made them feel seen. As the international exhibition approached, Amara felt more grounded than she ever had before. She was nervous, of course. The stakes were higher than ever. But she also felt a quiet confidence that came from knowing she was on her own path, on her own terms. The exhibition was a massive success. Her work was hailed as a triumph, and the event solidified her place as one of the most important new voices in contemporary art. But more than the accolades or the sales, what mattered most to Amara was the connection she saw in the eyes of the people who viewed her art. They didn't just see colors and shapes on a canvas. They saw her story, her truth. As she stood in the gallery, surrounded by her paintings and the quiet murmur of the crowd, Amara knew she had come full circle. The years of rejection, the pain of being overlooked, the constant fight to prove herself, it had all led her to this moment. And in the end, she hadn't just broken through the barriers that had been placed in front of her, she had shattered them. The karma of it all wasn't lost on her. The galleries that had once shut her out were now the ones being left behind. The people who had dismissed her were now asking for her time and attention. But Amara had learned to value herself, to choose her path carefully. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. In the quiet moments after the exhibition ended, Amara stood in front of her favorite piece, the one that had sparked tears in a stranger, the one that had set everything in motion. She smiled to herself, feeling a sense of peace she had never known before. Her journey was far from over, but she had found her place. She had found her power, and she knew, deep in her heart, that the best was still yet to come. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.